At the height of the Cold War, there was one country where Soviet cars weren't rejected. They were respected. Not tolerated, not ignored, not explained away as political necessity. Actually respected. That country was Finland, and the car was the GAZ M-20 Pobeda, a Soviet machine, built inside the Iron Curtain, sold openly in Western showrooms, driven through Scandinavian winters, and remembered decades later by the people who used it. This shouldn't have happened. Everything about the post-war world said it couldn't. The Iron Curtain divided Europe into two systems that didn't share roads, didn't trade cars, didn't mix their daily lives. One side built socialism, the other side built department stores. Those worlds stayed separate. Except they didn't, not entirely, not always. And the proof is sitting right there in a Finnish archive photograph from the early 1950s. A wet Helsinki street, Fords, Volvos, German models, that survived the war. And right in the middle of all of them, parked like it belongs there, a Soviet car. No flags, no propaganda, no escort. Just a car on a street. That image is the question this video is going to answer. How did it get there? Why did it stay? And why, against every expectation, did the Finns actually think it was worth driving? Let's start with the name. Because with Soviet products, the name always meant something. Pobeda. In Russian, victory. The project began in 1943. The war wasn't over. Millions were still dying. Cities were still burning. And yet, Soviet leadership authorized the development of a new civilian automobile because they were already confident they would win. That confidence was not casual. It was earned in blood. At Stalingrad, at Kursk, in the siege of Leningrad, the Soviet Union had absorbed the worst that Nazi Germany could deliver and had not broken. By 1943, the momentum had shifted. The outcome, for those willing to read it, clearly, was becoming visible. So they started building a car. The man responsible was Andrei Lipgat, chief designer at the Gorky automobile plant GAZ located roughly 400 kilometers east of Moscow. Lipgat had been building vehicles at GAZ since the 1930s. He understood Soviet conditions. He understood Soviet roads. And he understood, perhaps better than anyone in that position, what it would take to build something that actually worked in a country as vast and as brutal as Russia. The war ended in 1945. The Pobeda was ready in 1946. And here's where it gets interesting. When the GAZ M-20 was revealed, Western automotive observers did something they hadn't planned to do. They paid attention. Not because a Soviet car was supposed to be interesting, because this one actually was. The design was pontoon body construction, a single continuous flowing form, wheels integrated into the body, lines uninterrupted from front to rear, no separate fenders. No bulging wings bolted onto a chassis like furniture. In 1946, this was not standard. Most cars in the world still carried the design language of the previous generation, separate fenders, upright grilles, bodies that looked assembled from parts rather than shaped as a whole. The Studebaker Champion, often cited as a landmark of American pontoon design, arrived in 1947. The Pobeda was already there. A Soviet engineering team, working in a country that had just lost somewhere between 26 and 27 million people, produced a design that was, by the standards of its moment, genuinely modern. That's the part nobody expects. The engine was a 2.1-liter inline four-cylinder producing around 50 horsepower. Not powerful. Nobody is going to pretend otherwise. But the engineering priority was never power. It was survival. The suspension was built for roads that weren't roads, gravel tracks, frozen earth, mud that could swallow a lesser vehicle whole. Ground clearance was generous. The structure was heavy and solid in the way that things built to last in hostile environments tend to be heavy and solid. Inside, a heater that worked, a radio, on some models, wide seats, a dashboard that told you what you needed to know and nothing more. For the Soviet citizen, it was luxury. For the European buyer in 1950, and some would become European buyers, It was a competitive, if modest, family sedan, not a luxury car, not a performance car. A car that did what cars were supposed to do in conditions that many cars refused to face. That distinction, built to survive, not to impress, would matter enormously when this machine crossed into Finland. Here's what most people don't know about Finland in the post-war period. It wasn't Eastern Bloc. It wasn't fully Western, either. It was something harder to categorize: a sovereign democracy sitting directly on the Soviet border, having fought 2 wars against its neighbor, having lost both, having survived anyway. The Winter War, 1939 to 1940. Finland lost territory it never got back. The Continuation War, 1941 to 1944. More territory. More losses, but the country itself, its government, its independence, its democratic system, remained intact. That alone made Finland unique among the Soviet Union's Western neighbors. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania absorbed, Poland restructured, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, reorganized under Soviet-friendly governments. Finland, still holding elections, still reading uncensored newspapers, still making its own decisions. But not without a cost. The Paris Peace Treaty of 1947 imposed war reparations on Finland that were substantial by any measure. For 8 years, 1944 to 1952, Finland transferred manufactured goods to the Soviet Union on a structured schedule: ships, industrial machinery, cables, metal products, precision components. The Finns, characteristically, refused to fail at this. Finnish industry modernized under the pressure of the reparations obligation. Quality control became almost a cultural obsession. What had been imposed as punishment became, strangely, a catalyst. When the reparations period ended in 1952, Finland had an industrial base that was significantly stronger than it had been before the obligation began. And then, something unexpected happened. The trade didn't stop. Finland and the Soviet Union continued doing business, not because anyone was forced to, the reparations were done, but because the commercial logic was real. Finland needed export markets. The Soviet Union, cautiously, was interested in demonstrating that it could participate in legitimate international commerce. That's where the cars come in. The GAZ M-20 Pobeda arrived in Finland as a commercial product. Not propaganda, not a diplomatic gesture, a product with a price, in a showroom, available to anyone who wanted to buy one. Soviet authorities in the early 1950s were pursuing hard currency and something else: credibility. The idea that Soviet industry could compete on the open market, could produce something that a free consumer in a free country would choose to purchase. The Pobeda was their most presentable civilian automobile. Modern in appearance, functional, priced below most comparable Western alternatives. Finland was the logical destination. The trade infrastructure already existed. The border was right there. The railway connections worked. And Finland in the early 1950s, while developing rapidly, was not yet the wealthy country it would become by the 1960s. Price sensitivity was genuine. A car that offered real transportation for less money than a Swedish or German alternative had an argument to make. So the cars arrived, not in the hundreds of thousands. Finland was never a mass market, but enough to matter, enough to be visible, enough that Finnish mechanics learned to work on them. Enough that Finnish drivers, opinionated as they are, formed views about them. And this is where it gets strange. The views weren't bad. Finnish winters are not kind to cars. Temperatures plunge well below freezing. Roads ice over. Snow accumulates in densities that challenge modern vehicles equipped with modern everything. In the post-war period, with roads that were often unpaved and maintenance that was often unavailable, a vehicle that couldn't handle these conditions wasn't a vehicle, it was an obstacle. The Pobeda, built for Soviet conditions, handled Finland. Finnish drivers who used the car in this period and their accounts survive, in automotive histories, in personal memoirs, in the records of motoring clubs described it in consistent terms. It started in the cold. It handled rough surfaces without complaint. It kept running when keeping running was the only thing that mattered. Not glamorous praise, but in Finland, in winter, that's the praise that counts. The car did not pretend to be something it wasn't. It had no chrome excess, no exaggerated styling, no features added to impress rather than to function. It was honest about what it was, a solid, utilitarian, surprisingly durable machine, designed for a country that had no patience for fragility. Finland had no patience for fragility either. That alignment between a car's design philosophy and a country's national character is not something you can engineer deliberately. It's something that happens, or it doesn't. In this case, it happened. Some Finns bought the Pobeda for purely economic reasons. It was cheaper, and they needed a car. Some may have been drawn by novelty. The occasional political sympathizer may have been involved, though Finland's politics in this period were carefully, deliberately maintained to avoid any appearance of Soviet alignment. But whatever the individual motivations, the pattern was the same. The car went to work. It performed. It earned not admiration exactly, but something close to it among the people who value competence over appearance, which is a very Finnish kind of respect. Step back from the car for a moment. Think about what this story is actually saying. The Cold War presented itself as a clean division, East and West, two systems, two worlds, a curtain that separated them clearly and permanently. The ideological machinery on both sides worked constantly to maintain this clarity, to make sure the separation seemed total, inevitable, and absolute. But it wasn't. It never quite was. Finland's existence was itself a daily refutation of the clean division. A democratic country on the Soviet border, doing business with Moscow, maintaining its independence, navigating a position that the binary logic of Cold War ideology said shouldn't be possible. The Pobeda in Finnish showrooms was a small version of the same refutation, a Soviet car in a Western market, a product built under communism being evaluated and purchased by consumers, exercising free choice. The choice, in some cases, was yes. Commerce moved where commerce could move. People made practical decisions. The grand narrative of absolute ideological separation was, on the ground, in the daily texture of ordinary life, constantly being complicated by reality. That's not a cynical observation. It's an honest one. The Pobeda in Helsinki wasn't a crack in the Iron Curtain. It was a reminder that the Iron Curtain, for all its symbolic power, never described the world with perfect accuracy. The world was always more complicated. The people living in it were always making choices that didn't fit cleanly into the categories the era had prepared for them. The GAZ M-20 Pobeda was produced from 1946 to 1958, 12 years. Approximately 235,000 units, built at the Gorky plant. Modest by Western standards, significant by Soviet ones. There were variants. The M-20B, a convertible produced in smaller numbers, intended for official and luxury use, ambulance configurations, taxi versions that became common sights in Soviet cities. A four-wheel drive prototype that never reached production but demonstrated that Lipgart's team was thinking beyond the obvious. And then there was Poland. The Pobeda's design was licensed to Polish manufacturers and produced there as the Warszała, and here's the detail that should stop you cold. The Warszała continued in production until 1973. 15 years after GAZ stopped building the original. In modified forms, yes. With updated components, yes. But recognizably descended from the same machine, using the same fundamental architecture. A design that Soviet engineers developed during the final years of World War II was still being built in Poland in the same decade that saw the Apollo moon landings. That is not an endorsement of the car's modernity. It is an endorsement of its practicality, of the fact that the core engineering made sense, held up, and continued making sense long after the original political context had shifted. The car that replaced the Pobeda at GAZ was the M21 Volga, introduced in 1956, larger, more powerful, more sophisticated. The Volga carried the Pobeda's spirit into a new era, and is its own remarkable story. But the Pobeda was the foundation. The proof that Soviet engineers could produce something real. Something that worked not just within the Soviet system, but outside it, in conditions and markets that owed nothing to Soviet ideology, and therefore owed the car nothing but honest evaluation. The honest evaluation in Finland had been, it works. The surviving Pobedas are artifacts now. Russian collections hold them, Polish museums display them. Finnish enthusiasts, knowing exactly what they have, maintain a handful of them in working condition. These heavy, slightly mysterious machines from a world that no longer exists in any form. If you have ever stood next to one, you know what they communicate. There is nothing frivolous about the design, no unnecessary curve, no decorative flourish that serves appearance over function. Every line has a reason. The reason is survive. Start one up if you ever have the chance, and listen to that 4-cylinder engine find its rhythm. Rough at first, perhaps, depending on how long it's been sitting. Then, steadier. Then running. You are hearing something that belongs entirely to its moment, to the specific confluence of events that produced it, the war, the victory, the reconstruction, the strange commerce of the Cold War, the Finnish winters, the pragmatic drivers who asked only that it do its job and found, to their measured satisfaction, that it did. The world that made this car is gone. The car, some of them, are still here. History doesn't move in straight lines. It moves the way that Soviet car moved across a border it wasn't supposed to cross, into a market it wasn't supposed to enter, earning a kind of respect it wasn't supposed to deserve. Against the grain, against the expectations, against the narrative that everyone had agreed to tell. The GAZ M-20 Pobeda did what cars are supposed to do. It carried people from one place to another. In one of the most divided moments in modern history, it crossed a line, a real line, a geopolitical line, and kept going. That's worth knowing. Now I want to hear from you. Did you ever see one of these? Did you drive one, or ride in one, or know someone who did? Were you there in Finland, in the Soviet Union, in Poland, anywhere in that world during those years? Leave it in the comments. This channel runs on that kind of memory, and memories like yours don't have an expiration date. If this video gave you something, a new angle on a story you thought you knew, a piece of history that deserved more attention than it gets, hit the like button. It's the fastest way to tell me this kind of content matters, and it puts this story in front of the people who would want to find it. Subscribe if you haven't, not for every video about every car. For the ones that have a real story behind them, the machines that carry history inside their metal, the moments that the standard books skip past, the questions that sound simple until you actually try to answer them. Why did the Finns like a Soviet car? Now you know. See you in the next one.